Um,
We're live.
okay, we're live. Here we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our channel. Thank you for stopping by. My name is Travis.
Hi, everybody. I'm Seth. We're working on a game called Altered World. Once again, shout out to all 230 of you that have been so kind as to give us a follow on Instagram. We really appreciate it. We're on Instagram. We're on Facebook. We've got a YouTube channel. We're just really excited to be sharing the process with you, give you kind of a behind the curtains peek at what we're doing. So today, what we want to talk about was, as far as game systems go, rules heavy or rules light. Travis, what do you think?
So this is something where, I mean, people have kind of violent opinions on this, right? I have always, I don't know if it's because of the systems that I started playing, or what that tends to be. I always gravitate towards rules heavy systems, for a number of different reasons.
Now,
Like I said,
is that what people call crunchy?
yeah, crunchy, which I think we borrow from Warhammer. I think is where that term comes from. That they would release a new supplement, and there'd be a bunch of fluff, and then there'd be a bunch of crunch, and you would always get mad when the new book that you just paid for was mostly fluff as opposed to mostly crunch. Um, but yeah, so I gravitate towards rules heavy systems partly because my first experiences with D&D were second edition, so it was all still in the THACO days, and you had to do backwards math, and it was just very difficult. Um, and then I think my very first role playing game experience was with the first edition of Middle Earth role playing, which was a percentile based dice, critical hit tables. There was a lot of very kind of defined mechanical
Even
stuff.
D&D had that stuff. Like before everything was a DC or a D20 DC based system. You had like I remember playing Rogues, and you had like all these different things you could do, and it was all based on a 2d10 kind of percentile
Yeah,
system. Yeah.
yeah, and Middle Earth was always, it was um, percentile for everything. We had, and then one of the other systems that I played and really enjoyed was Battle Lords of the 23rd Century, which was again um, a percentile based kind of rules heavy system. I think people have started to gravitate away from rules heavy systems and lean more towards the rules medium, rules light, whatever.
Which is kind of where fifth edition D&D fits in on the spectrum, right? Like it
I
feels like a relatively rules light system to me.
No, so I mean, from what I've seen, right, the rules light systems are really things like Blades in the Dark, and there's a system called Caltrop Core, where your rating, it's like there's a defined success number, right? You're rolling only d6s, and a 6 is a success, and your character's stat is the number of d6s you get to roll in order to get at least 1 6, um, uh, which seems somewhat similar to like the World of Darkness stuff.
Okay.
But like some of those systems, it's literally your character has 3 or 4 different attributes, and that's it. And it's just a number of dice. And if you get one
So
success on any of those rolls, you're
those
good.
lean on kind of a role playing storytelling experience a little more. So
Yeah,
maybe D&D
100%.
fifth edition, just for frame of reference, D&D fifth edition might be considered more rules medium then.
Yeah, I think the way most people play it, it probably falls rules medium.
Yeah,
Because
I like that as a frame of reference because I think most people who are going to come to our system are probably coming from Dungeons and Dragons fifth edition, which is a lot of fun. We both play it, we both enjoy it. It has its place,
yeah,
but
for sure.
in this day and age, we're just trying to bring a system to market that lets people do different things. Tell stories in a different way. So we were talking about mechanics and what we've got to offer, and you were breaking it down in a particular way that I thought was really helpful.
Yeah, so I would say that Altered World leans heavy, right? In the sense that there are rules to cover very specific scenarios, so that if you have this situation arise and you don't want to just wing it, you can look to the book, and there's a defined rule for most of those situations. Nothing's all encompassing, but there's a pretty defined rule about this is how you adjudicate this type of scenario. What's interesting about it, though, is a good example. There's some very, very robust rules for the use of fully automatic weapons in this game system. And if you've got somebody that was a Marine Corps machine gunner and they love that thing, they're going to love those rules because they are very um, specific about 3 or 4 different ways you can employ that kind of a weapon system and all of that. So, but if you're not using that kind of a firearm, those rules just like don't come into play, and you just ignore them and whatever. Um, and so they're there for people who care about them, and they're just ignored by people who don't. Um,
Right.
but what's interesting is that Altered World is a rules heavy system that I feel like plays mostly like a rules light system, and there's two real core things that make that work. One is that to the greatest extent possible, all of the math, um, as much of the math as can be done before you actually roll the dice, is done before you roll the dice. So you, based on your talent rating or your power rating and your related attributes, whatever those may happen to be, you do all the calculations ahead of time, and Altered World uses a fixed DC system. So you're trying to achieve a score of 20 on two 10-sided dice, adding in your talent rating and related attribute. So, or whatever, talent, power, whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and so because it's a fixed DC, you can do all the math ahead of time and say, what do I actually just need to roll in order to be successful? There is some math that goes on the backside of what do I do when I exceed 20,
Hmm.
and how can I use what those are called success levels. And there's multiple ways that those can be used to do different things based on what the player wants to achieve. Um, and there's other times where there is almost a floating DC that's out there, where it's the idea that it's often in tasks that are either competition based, or they're tasks that might take a long period of time. It's not something that really makes sense to do just one roll. And so it's a thing where you have this floating DC out there, and every time you make a roll that you succeed and achieve a 20, you add to your effort over time
Right.
in achieving
So
this.
this mechanic you're describing, we call that an action roll base, which we abbreviate as
Right,
ARB.
right,
And these subsets, you have competition rolls, and then what you're talking about, like what do we call them? Accumulation rolls.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and there's one fourth variation of the ARB, or of the action roll, which is a resistance roll, which is used primarily to resist damage that has gotten through your armor or
Hmm.
force field or whatever you may happen to have as protective equipment. And
Sure.
so stepping back one bit, there are essentially the first is that we do as much of the math ahead of time as we can. The second is that we simplify the rolls that you make as much as we can. There are two core dice roll mechanics. There you either have a target roll with a couple of different variations of what that looks like, or a action roll with 4 different variations. And we've just now talked about all 4 variations. You have a standard action roll. You have an accumulation roll where you're trying to accumulate success over time. You have a competition roll where 2 characters are vying for a given outcome. And
Most
so
commonly, you see that in combat, right?
right. So if the 2 characters are grappling, they're both going to make a roll, and then whoever is more successful at the task is going to come out on top.
Right.
And then the fourth is the resistance roll, and it's basically just 20 minus your related attribute, or relevant attribute, and then your die
Yeah.
roll.
And so then after that, you've got target rolls, and we've got low target rolls and high target rolls.
Right. And so low target rolls are situations where you want to roll under or equal to the target number. And so this is
And
cases.
importantly, these are done on a single D10.
Yes. Yeah. So they're a single D10 die. So if you have so the second type is a high target roll. So with a high target roll, you are explicitly trying to exceed the number of whatever the target is. So if the target is 5, you have to roll a 6 or better in order to be successful.
Right.
An example of a target roll is there's a very interesting talent that we have that I think is something that I've never seen in any other game, representing kind of a Columbo style of information gathering or interrogation, where you're having this conversation with somebody, and the conversation doesn't necessarily flow the way that an interrogation normally does, where I ask you a question and you give me some kind of answer or try not to or whatever. It's more of a circuitous kind of roundabout conversation where I'm gathering information that you may or may not be aware that you have given me. And in that case, the defender makes a high target roll against the rating of this talent that the interrogator has to determine whether or not they can even figure out that that's happening.
Yeah.
And so
right
higher
now,
rating is better.
yeah, right now we're calling this a conversant. It's a sub skill of one of the talents, right? Conversant.
Right.
And so that's really interesting, right? Like, of course, you're rewarded for having a higher rating because somebody's making a high target roll against your rating, so they have to roll higher than your rating. So if your rating is 7, it's harder for your opponent to roll an 8, 9, or 10 than if your rating is a 4, then they've got to roll a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. So obviously, the math works out, right? The mechanic is the higher your rating, the more difficult it is for them to succeed.
Yeah. And then with low target rolls, I'm trying to think of an example.
Perception is the best one, right? Like
Yeah.
lots of
Yeah.
games have a mechanic for you to notice things, and this is a core mechanic across lots of tabletop role playing games. To me, it's always one of the more important things. If I'm making a character, I want to make sure that they're good at noticing what's going on, right?
Right.
Because that
Sure.
can have dramatic impacts downstream from that role. So you want to make a low target roll against your perception in Altered World. So the higher your perception is, then the more chances you have of rolling underneath that on a single 10-sided die.
Yeah. And so that's a good example of that, and I was kind of failing momentarily to pull one up in my brain, but
The other exciting one to talk about is chances of death and stun.
yeah.
So
And that's
weapons have a base damage, and they also can do a certain chance of either killing you outright or stunning you, which is basically knocking you out. And there are ways to modify those numbers, but the damage, as we talked about earlier, that's a resistance roll. And then on top of that, you can make a low target roll versus the chances of stun or death to see if you succumb to those, which makes combat potentially very, very deadly. Even if you can soak the damage, sometimes you just get hit, in a vital spot, and that's enough to do you in. So when you have 15K3 coming at you, that means you've got 15 points of damage you need to worry about, which is a lot, and then 3 chances of death. So you want to make.
that's a high target roll, right? You're trying to
Yeah,
exceed
you
the
are
number of-
correct.
yeah.
So
Yeah. So if you got
whatever
3
that
chances of
is,
death, you want a 4 or above,
yeah,
or spend some experience, depending on your
right.
situation.
And that's worth a whole nother stream. We put some posts out. If people are finding this stuff intriguing, please go back and read our posts on Instagram or Facebook. We've got some. Usually on Thursdays we're posting Mechanics Corner posts.
Yeah, I
we
think
talk
of late
about-
we've gone into a little bit more of the world building and kind of
Yeah.
narrative setting, but yeah,
But if you
there's
go back
a
and
good bunch of them. Yeah.
Yeah, look for Mechanics Corner posts. And we've got some that talk about spinning experience and what level does for you in this game. There's a lot there. But those were the mechanics we wanted to talk about today. Um,
Yeah.
and I think this is a good time to maybe segue into just an update of where we are in general.
Yeah. So we've both independently completed our edits of the talents and the traits, which is advantages and disadvantages
Mhm.
chapters, and we are working through consolidating and
Arguing and fighting.
well, yeah, adjudicating it, coming up with the final answer on our edits for the talents chapter, and that's about, I think, probably about 75% of the way through that.
Yeah,
Then
we
we
made
have
a good push
traits.
on talents, but it's
Yeah,
taken a lot longer than we thought it would. We got really
yeah, for
bogged down
sure.
in a couple of them. And what we're doing is we're going through a manual that somebody wrote 20, 25 years ago, right? We're
Yeah,
licensing this game from them for those who might be new to the channel to understand what we're doing. Um, and we're putting the finishing touches and getting this thing ready to release. It's a really great product. It's a fun game. Anybody we've played it with uh, really enjoys themselves with it. We enjoyed it. That's why we want to bring this thing to market. But we've noticed, like, as we go through some of the talents, like there might not be a mechanical benefit that's adequately explained. And as we get into traits, sometimes it's like, well, what's the difference between having this advantage at a rating 1 versus a rating 2? As it was written, maybe it wasn't clear. So we've had to get really into the weeds with this stuff and figure out, oh, hey, like if we push down over here, this thing over here pops up and we got to address that.
right.
So
Yeah,
it's more time consuming than we thought. It is good. We're making sure that when we release this thing, it'll be a polished product that everybody
yeah,
will have a good time with, and we'll be proud to have put it out on the market.
yeah, for sure. I think the um, what we, a lot of what we're dealing with too is, we've said this before, but the way that the book was written for the people that were hanging around with the game master in many ways. And so there's a certain conversational tone, which in some ways is really good. But there's a lot of jargon and kind of idiom that if you weren't part of that crew back in 98, the late 19th century or 20th century, you wouldn't really necessarily understand where we're coming from. And there's a certain kind of Gen X edginess to some of the way things are written that we don't think is going to go over quite as well. And so there's a whole bunch of that we're trying to fix, but there's also just streamlining. And then the one thing that I think is going to be one of our biggest challenges as we move forward, is going to require a lot of work, is this game was written when the only way anybody played outside of a convention or a tournament was theater of the mind. And so updating this so that the rules work with theater of the mind, but are also viable for the kind of more modern way of playing with battle maps and figurines, um, or on a virtual tabletop.
Yeah, and
Really
just
important.
in case there's anybody who's not familiar with those terms, theater of the mind being like you don't have any props, right?
Right,
You can play theater of the mind with your buddies all sitting around the same table in the same physical space. It's also real easy to do virtually, right?
right,
Even outside of virtual tabletops that are available these days, all you need is audio, right? You can just
right.
talk your way through it, and everybody is hopefully imagining the same sort of scenario. Whereas
Right.
outside of theater of the mind, that's when you get into tabletop miniatures or virtual tabletops where you have some sort of prop to show,
Yeah.
hey, this is where I am in this space relative to everybody else. And then things like how far you can move in a given period of time and how many things you can do in a given turn, all those start to take on a different significance when you play with those rules. And we want to make sure Altered World is enjoyable for people who like both styles.
Yeah, for sure. I think, because, after third edition D&D, that Dungeons and Dragons at least very heavily leaned into the tactical gameplay, skirmish gameplay, and so that is, we recognize that that's the framework that most people are going to be coming from when they come to Altered World, and so we want to make sure that if they want to play that way, they can, because really the core tenet, if there is a core tenet, one of the core ideas of our game is to eliminate the factors that bind players and game masters into a box. We want to knock the walls off of that and just let people do what they want to do within a framework that allows them to do it fairly and for all the players at the table, and so that everybody can have a good time.
Absolutely. I think that's a good snapshot of where we are, and probably a good place for us to wrap up.
Yeah. So we want to thank everybody for taking the time to. We had a couple people stop in over on Instagram. We thank you for showing up, Lauren Nerd Life and HB Tales. We appreciate you coming in, or Heb Tales. I don't know how to read it. But we thank you for stopping in, and thank everybody else who stopped in either on YouTube or on Facebook. Check us out, see what you like.
Leave us some comments. We really want to hear from you.
Yeah,
we'd
love to hear.
Building this thing, and we want to get everybody engaged. Like, hopefully, before long, we can start thinking about play tests. Tell us your ideas. Tell us what you think. We look forward to hearing from you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody, and have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye.